Last summer, a retired game warden in East Texas sat down at a folding table with 2 coolers, 14 rods, and a notebook. On one side, 7 jars of the best-selling commercial catfish baits in America, $14 a pop. On the other side, a mason jar filled with something he mixed in his kitchen for 71 cents. 5 years and over 3,000 logged casts later, his results were so lopsided that not a single bait company would return his calls. His name is Roy Caldwell, and by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what was in that jar. But here's the thing. Roy's recipe isn't even the craziest thing you're about to hear. Because before we get to the 3 cheapest, most scientifically devastating legal baits on the planet, we're going to walk through the dark side first. 7 baits so effective, or so destructive, that the government had to outlaw them. Some carry $10,000 fines. One is a federal felony. 10 baits, 7 banned, 3 legal. 71 cents beats $14. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why. Grab a notebook, brother. This is the countdown they don't want you to finish. The dark side of the tackle box. Let's start where the law draws the line. Number 10, the chemical nuke, bleach-soaked bread balls. In 1998, a game warden in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, walked up on 14 men standing knee-deep in a bayou. No rods, no reels, just dip nets and 5-gallon buckets. The surface of the water was covered in fish, floating belly up, twitching, barely alive. What those men had done was tear up loaves of white bread, soak them in diluted household bleach, and scatter them across a slow-moving channel. Within minutes, every fish in a 50-yard radius was stunned, disoriented, and rising to the surface like leaves in a storm drain. Here's what happens on a biological level. Sodium hypochlorite, the active chemical in bleach, is a violent oxidizing agent. The second it hits the water, it attacks the cellular membranes of a fish's gills. Imagine trying to breathe through a paper towel that's on fire. That's what bleach does to gill tissue. It shuts down their ability to extract oxygen. The fish don't bite the bread because they're hungry. They float to the top because their bodies are failing. But it doesn't stop at the fish you see. The bleach wipes out the microinvertebrates, the insect larvae, the entire invisible food web that holds an ecosystem together. The EPA classified this as chemical fishing in 1991. If you get caught, you're looking at up to $10,000 in fines and 2 years in federal prison. All 14 of those men in Louisiana were arrested. Every single one. Now that one was a weapon of mass destruction. But the next bait on our list? It doesn't poison anything. It just invades. And it never, ever leaves. Number 9, the Golden Menace, live pet store goldfish. If you've ever dangled a bright orange goldfish in front of a largemouth bass, you already know what happens. The bass doesn't think. It doesn't hesitate. That high-contrast flash of orange in dark water triggers a kill switch in its brain, a hardwired, violent strike response that no plastic swim bait in the world can replicate. So why is using live goldfish as bait now illegal in 38 states? Because every goldfish that slips off your hook is a biological time bomb. Goldfish are members of the carp family. They're not delicate little pet store decorations once they hit open water. They're tanks. They survive in water so fouled that native species can't breathe. A single female can release over 40,000 eggs a year. State fisheries crews in the Midwest have pulled goldfish out of public lakes weighing over 4 pounds. bulldozing through aquatic vegetation, outcompeting native panfish for food and spawning habitat. One careless bait dump at the end of the day, and you've introduced an invasive species that will outlast you, your children, and probably your grandchildren. Fines run between $200 and $1,000. But at least goldfish are alive. The next one on our list? It comes in a spray can, and your grandpa probably swore it was the best fishing secret he ever learned. Number 8. The garage myth. WD-40 sprayed on lures. All right, let's settle this one right now, because I know half of you watching just sat up in your chair. The legend goes like this. Spray a little WD-40 on a plastic worm or a crankbait, and the fish will hit it like a freight train. Your grandpa did it. Your uncle did it. Somebody on a fishing forum in 2004 swore it doubled their catch rate. And the myth says it works because WD-40 secretly contains fish oil. It doesn't. Not a drop. WD-40 is a blend of petroleum distillates and aliphatic hydrocarbons. It's a solvent, a lubricant, a toxic pollutant. So why did it seem to work? Here's the actual science, and it's almost funny. When you handle a fishing lure with bare hands, you leave behind traces of an amino acid called L-serine. Fish hate it. L-serine is a chemical alarm signal. It tells fish that a predator with hands has been here. The WD-40 doesn't attract fish. It just masks the thing that was scaring them away. It's not a magnet. It's an eraser. In 2019, researchers at Virginia Tech ran a controlled experiment. WD-40 versus an unsprayed control lure. The result? Zero measurable difference in fish approach rates. None. And here's the kicker. Spraying petroleum-based chemicals into public waterways is a discharge violation under the Clean Water Act, making it illegal in 47 states. You're risking a massive fine to apply a chemical that doesn't even do what you think it does. So Grandpa's secret? Turns out, it was just really clean hands. Now, speaking of old-school secrets, the river rats had one that actually did work, and it came from under the kitchen sink. Number 7. The Sudsy Killer. Dish soap chunks. Picture this. It's 1985. A man in the Ozarks cuts a bar of heavy-scented dish soap into 1-inch cubes, rigs them on a circle hook with a split-shot weight, and drops them into a slow bend of the White River. 20 minutes later, he's pulling channel catfish out of water that nobody else on the bank has gotten a single bite from. The science behind it is genuinely fascinating. Soap contains rendered animal fats and heavy lipids. To the hundreds of thousands of chemoreceptors covering a catfish's body, those fatty acid molecules read exactly like the chemical signature of decaying prey, a rotting shad, a dead crawfish breaking apart in the current. The soap dissolves slowly, sending a scent plume downstream that catfish can track from hundreds of yards away. But here's the cost. As the soap breaks down, it releases artificial surfactants into the water. Those chemicals destroy the surface tension that aquatic insects depend on. They strip the protective mucous membranes off fish and amphibians, the slime coat that keeps infection out. It's like removing someone's skin and telling them to go swimming. 12 states have explicitly banned it, including Arkansas, Missouri, and Tennessee. Fines range from $150 to $500 per offense. Now, so far, every banned bait on this list involves putting something toxic or invasive into the water. But what if I told you the next one uses something you'd find in your dog's bowl? Number 6. The algae bloomer. Bulk dog food chumming. You want to create an absolute feeding frenzy? Take a 50-pound bag of dry dog food, paddle out to a cove, and dump it. Within an hour, every bottom feeder, carp, and catfish in the zip code will be circling your boat like it's Thanksgiving dinner. The protein, the fat, the heavy meat odor, it dissolves fast, and it rings the dinner bell loud. And it is devastatingly, undeniably effective. So why is it banned in 29 states? 2 words: oxygen theft. When you dump massive amounts of processed, nutrient-dense animal feed into a lake, whatever the fish don't eat starts to rot. And when it rots, it floods the water with nitrogen and phosphorus. That triggers an explosion of algae, thick, toxic, green mats that cover the surface. When the algae dies, bacteria move in to break it down, and that process sucks every molecule of dissolved oxygen out of the water column. It's called hypoxia. And when it happens, fish don't just die. They suffocate. Thousands of them. In 2018, a man in Georgia was fined $3,000 for dumping dog food into a public reservoir. The fish kill that followed took the lake nearly 2 years to recover from. You threw a party for the fish, and then you killed every guest. Now, the next one on our list is going to surprise you, because it's the most innocent thing imaginable. Something your grandmother probably used to feed the ducks at the park. Number 5. The white bread dilemma. A wadded-up piece of white sandwich bread on a hook. That's it. For generations, it's been the first bait every kid in America learns to use. Bluegill, carp, mullet, they'll eat it all day long. So how did bread end up on a banned list? The answer came from across the Atlantic. In the UK, several major commercial fisheries started noticing something disturbing. Fish that were being caught and released in heavily pressured waters were getting fat. Not muscular, healthy fat, bloated, lethargic, dying. They called it fat fish syndrome. Highly processed white bread is packed with empty carbohydrates, bleached flour, and sugar, but it's completely devoid of the amino acids and proteins a fish's body needs to function. Fish were gorging on the stuff anglers were throwing in as chum, filling their stomachs with nutritional garbage and slowly starving to death from the inside out. Liver failure, organ shutdown, death by junk food. It's not a federal crime in the U.S. yet, but private lakes, conservation areas, and catch-and-release fisheries are banning it fast. The recommendation now is high-protein fish pellets instead. And that leads us to the bait that breaks more hearts than any other on this list, because it came this close to being perfectly, universally legal. Number 4. The golden carpet. Bulk corn chumming. Let me be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. Putting a few kernels of canned sweet corn on your hook is 100% legal in every single state in America. This is not about corn on a hook. This is about corn by the bucket. Canned sweet corn is one of the most effective baits ever discovered for trout and carp. That bright yellow color is a neon target in murky water. The high sugar content, sucrose and fructose, triggers a feeding response that fish have almost no ability to resist. It's cheap, it's everywhere, and it flat out catches fish. But chumming with it, dumping handfuls or entire cans into the water to draw fish in, is strictly illegal in 11 states, including Colorado, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Utah. Here's why the line exists. Fish, especially trout, cannot digest the tough outer cellulose hull of a corn kernel. A few kernels off a hook, the fish passes them through no problem. But a pile of chummed corn, the fish gorges, and that cellulose builds up, creating intestinal blockages that can be fatal. On top of that, just like the dog food, Large quantities of decomposing corn in warm, shallow water will strip the dissolved oxygen and suffocate everything nearby. The difference between legal and illegal here is the difference between a meal and a massacre. The science of the strike. All right, take a breath. 7 baits, fines, felonies, ecological disasters, and a whole lot of reasons the government had to step in. You might be sitting there thinking, is there anything left that actually works and won't land me in handcuffs? Yeah, there is. And it's better than all 7 of those combined. But before I reveal the top 3, I need you to understand one thing, one concept, because once this clicks in your brain, you will never look at a $14 jar of commercial bait the same way again. Fish live in water. That sounds obvious, but think about what it means for their senses. They don't smell the air, they taste the water. Their senses of smell and taste, olfaction and gustation, are fused into a single, unbelievably powerful chemical detection system. They're reading the water the way you read a billboard. Take catfish. A channel catfish has up to 175,000 taste buds, not just on its tongue, on its entire body. Its whiskers, its flanks, its belly, its tail. Imagine if you could taste with your elbows. That's a catfish. It can detect a single amino acid at a concentration of 1 part per 10 billion. That's like finding one specific grain of sand on a beach the size of a football field. Now, here's where the money is. When the commercial tackle industry formulates a bait, they're trying to synthesize those amino acids in a lab, pack them with chemical preservatives so the stuff can sit on the shelf for 3 years, wrap it in slick packaging, and sell it to you for $14 a jar. They're reverse engineering nature, badly, and charging you a premium for the effort. But you don't need a lab. You don't need a chemistry degree. You just need the right aisle at the grocery store. Here are the 3 legal baits that the tackle industry prays you never learn about. The top 3, 100% legal. Exposed. Number 3, the sweet sinker, prepared tiger nuts. If you are targeting massive, pressured carp, the kind of wary, educated fish that have seen every $15 bag of imported boilies on the market and learned to swim right past them, listen closely. Because this is the bait that European carp anglers have been quietly dominating with for decades, and it's only now starting to cross the Atlantic. A tiger nut is not a nut. It's a small, dense tuber that grows underground. You can buy them raw in bulk for almost nothing. Here's what you do. Soak them in water for 24 hours. Then boil them for 30 minutes with a couple tablespoons of sugar or molasses. That boiling process does something remarkable. It gelatinizes the starches inside the tuber. The tiger nut swells, softens slightly, and begins to ferment, releasing a thick, sweet, milky liquid that is absolutely loaded with natural glucose and lipids. When you cast this to the bottom, it creates a dense, sugary cloud that sits right in the mud. And here's the thing about carp. They are biologically hardwired to root through sediment for high-calorie tubers and snails. A prepared tiger nut matches that profile so perfectly it's almost unfair. But the real advantage? Durability. A bluegill can peck at a tiger nut all day long and barely scratch it. A small catfish can mouth it and get nowhere. That tough, rubbery texture means your bait is still sitting there, intact and pumping out scent when the 30-pound trophy carp finally rolls through at dusk. Tiger nuts are legal everywhere. They cost pennies per bait. And the carp that have learned to ignore everything else on the market have no answer for them. But as good as the tiger nut is, the next bait makes it look expensive, because what I'm about to show you costs 11 cents to make. and it beat 9 commercial baits in a 6-year scientific test. Number 2. The Fruity Acid Bomb, Strawberry Jell-O Bread Dough. 11 cents. That's what this costs. 11 cents for a bait that a retired fisheries biologist spent 6 years proving is better than everything on the shelf. Here's the recipe. 2 slices of cheap white bread. Tear off the crusts. Add a pinch of strawberry Jell-O powder, a few drops of pure vanilla extract, and a tiny splash of water. Knead it in your hands for about 2 minutes until it forms a tight, smooth, rubbery dough ball. That's it. That's the whole thing. And it is a triple-threat biological weapon. Layer 1. Mechanics. The gluten network in the bread creates a tough, elastic matrix that grips the hook and resists washing off. Instead of dissolving all at once, it breaks down slowly, leaving a steady scent trail that pulls fish in from downstream. Layer 2. Visuals. Carp and panfish have excellent color vision, specifically tuned to detect red and pink wavelengths, the colors that pop hardest in muddy, turbid water. That Jell-O powder turns your bait into a glowing pink beacon in conditions where commercial baits disappear. Layer 3, and this is the one that makes it lethal. Strawberry Jell-O contains concentrated citric acid. When it hits the water, it drops the pH in a tiny radius around your bait. A fish's lateral line and olfactory system detect that localized acid shift as one very specific thing: naturally fermenting fruit. In river systems, fallen fruit that's rotting along the bank is a primary, high-energy food source. Your Jell-O dough is mimicking that signal perfectly. And the vanilla extract? It's an organic compound that bonds to the exact same chemoreceptors fish use to detect amino acids. You're hitting smell, sight, and taste simultaneously. 3 alarm bells at once. Dr. Glenn Marsh, a retired fisheries biologist, tested this 11-cent recipe against 9 of the most expensive commercial dough baits on the market over 6 years. Controlled conditions, same rods, same water, same rigs. The Jell-O dough caught 28% more carp and 34% more bluegill than the leading commercial brand. 28% for 11 cents. The industry has known about this for decades, but you can't patent bread and Jell-O, so they keep selling you their plastics and pastes at 40 times the markup, and they pray you never do the math. But we're not done, because everything you've heard so far, the tiger nuts, the Jell-O dough, all of it leads to this: the #1 bait on the countdown, the one a retired game warden staked his reputation on. Remember Roy Caldwell? It's time to open that jar. Number 1. The 71-cent weapon, garlic salt chicken liver. Roy Caldwell spent 30 years as a game warden on the Trinity River in East Texas. In 3 decades, he wrote thousands of tickets. Bleach fishing, illegal chumming, WD-40, corn dumps. He'd seen every shortcut and every excuse. But when he retired, he didn't stop going to the river. He just switched sides of the equation. Roy had a theory. He'd spent his career watching commercial bait companies sponsor tournaments, buy magazine ads, and convince anglers that you needed their $14 jars of engineered paste to catch catfish. And he didn't buy it. So he decided to prove it with data. He started with raw chicken liver. Every catfisherman knows liver works. It's loaded with blood proteins. Specifically, it contains roughly 600 milligrams of an amino acid called L-alanine per 100 grams. That's double the concentration in the best commercial stink baits on the market. Catfish can't resist L-alanine. Their entire sensory system is built to hunt it down. But raw liver has a fatal flaw. It's mush. Try to cast it on a heavy rod and it rips right off the hook before it hits the water. Every catfisherman also knows that frustration. Here's what Roy did. He took a tub of cheap chicken livers, laid them flat on a piece of cardboard, and buried them in garlic salt. Sealed the whole thing in a mason jar, put it in the fridge, and waited 48 hours. What happens inside that jar is a masterclass in biochemistry. The sodium chloride, the salt, creates massive osmotic pressure across the cell membranes of the liver. It physically pulls the water out of the tissue, shrinking the cells, collapsing the structure, and transforming that fragile, mushy liver into something dense, rubbery, and tough. Roy called it leather liver. You can thread it on a hook, cast it 100 yards on a bait caster, and it stays put. But it's not just about hookability. As the liver cures in that salt, the cell walls break down and release a concentrated burst of free amino acids into the surrounding garlic brine. And the garlic itself? Garlic contains an organosulfur compound called allicin. When allicin hits water, it disperses rapidly, creating a chemical scent plume that a channel catfish can detect from over 40 feet away in warm water. So you've got leather liver that stays on the hook, a payload of free amino acids that's twice as concentrated as commercial stink bait, and an allicin scent bomb that cuts through the water like a foghorn. Total cost? 71 cents. Roy tested it. Not once, not for a season, for 5 years. Same rods, same rigs, same spots on the Trinity River. His garlic salt liver against the 7 best-selling commercial punch and dip baits on the market. The results were not close. 37% more channel catfish, 41% more blue catfish, consistently, year after year. And Roy's favorite part of the whole experiment? In 30 years of writing tickets as a game warden, he never once wrote a citation for garlic liver. Because there is no law, not in any state, not in any county, against outsmarting a billion-dollar industry for less than $1. Closing. Listen, fishing has never been about who has the fattest wallet or the shiniest logo on their tackle bag. It's about understanding the water, understanding the animal, and using your brain instead of your credit card. The tackle industry built a system that keeps you dependent on their supply chain, their shelf space, their marketing. $14 jars of synthetic paste funding Super Bowl ads while a 71-cent recipe sits in your kitchen waiting. But now you know. You know why the banned baits are banned. You know why the legal baits are scientifically superior. And you know that a little salt, some Jell-O, and a whole lot of science just made everything on that tackle store shelf obsolete. Every person who subscribes to this channel is one more angler the industry can't fool. One more person who knows the math doesn't add up. So if this video showed you something they didn't want you to see, hit subscribe. Share it with the guy who's still buying $14 dough. And stick around, because here at Forbidden Lures, we are just getting started. Check your local regulations, respect the water, and tight lines, brother. I'll see you out there.